Hello, everyone. Welcome to today's Future Direction of Lab Medicine webinar for an update on FDA regulation of laboratory developed tests. I'm Dr. Matt Binnicker. I'm a director in the Division of Clinical Microbiology at Mayo Clinic and the Chief Scientific Officer for Mayo Collaborative Services. Joining me today is my colleague, Shannon Bennett. Shannon is the Director of Regulatory Affairs in the Department of Lab Medicine and Pathology at Mayo Clinic in Rochester, Minnesota. Just a few things to remind everyone before we begin today. There will be a question and answer period at the end of the presentation by posting on the Q&A icon on the Zoom link. So now I'd like to turn things over to Shannon Bennett to begin our presentation. Shannon, take it away.
Very good. Thanks, Dr. Binnicker. All right. So today we're going to be discussing the new medical device regulations for LDTs that FDA released and explain the 5 milestones and what those entail. And then Dr. Binnicker is going to go into a discussion on things labs should be thinking about now to begin moving into compliance. So just to set the stage, FDA has regulated medical devices since 1976. And at the time, LDTs did exist, but FDA chose to use broad enforcement discretion. So they indicated they could regulate LDTs, but they chose not to. And in the last 10 or 15 years or so, that has started to change, where FDA wants to take a more active role. So this started in 2014 when FDA released a guidance document stating how they would regulate or how they would propose to regulate LDTs. As you can imagine, there was a lot of industry pushback, and that guidance document was never finalized. A few years later, Congress got involved and started working on something called the VALID Act, which we've talked about in this venue before. And it went through a number of iterations, and there were a number of tries to get it passed, but it ultimately did not pass. So VALID is still kind of in the discussion. There is a version still bouncing around Congress, but it has a pretty tough road ahead of it. So that brings us to last October and this past May, where FDA first proposed and then finalized their own regulations for LDTs. And they basically say that clinical diagnostics are medical devices, whether they are made in a factory or they're made in a laboratory. So this does include LDTs. This is just a summary slide. We're going to go into detail on each of these, but here are the milestones. So FDA is using 5 milestones over 4 years to implement these new regulations. And all of them are predicated on the publication date of May 6th of this year. So in 1 year, May of 2025, labs will need to begin reporting medical device reporting issues to the FDA. 1 year later, we'll need to register and list. And in May 2027, labs will need to comply with certain quality system requirements. Then year 3.5, laboratories will need to submit all high-risk tests, in FDA parlance, that'd be class 3 tests, to the FDA if the test does not fall into an exemption or an enforcement discretion category, which we'll talk about here in a minute. And then by year 4, so May of 28, all other tests, so low and moderate risk, that are not exempt and not under an enforcement discretion category would need to be submitted to FDA. So that's the 4-year transition period. All right, so we'll go through each of these in a little more detail. First, we've got medical device reporting next May. So the good news is most likely your laboratory already has some sort of an adverse event or non-conforming event reporting process that you may need to expand upon, but you probably won't need to start from scratch. So step 1 is identifying when an event has occurred. And so FDA defines this as a death or serious injury of a patient as a result of testing. And also malfunction. So you're probably going to hear me say this a lot throughout this presentation, but malfunction is something we're going to need some guidance from FDA on because it's not clear what a malfunction of an LDT entails. But these are the requirements for things that would need to be reported to FDA. So the laboratory will need processes for investigating what happened, and FDA has very extensive documentation requirements. So not only what happened, who was involved, what were the impacts, what's the root cause, etc. And then if the adverse event meets certain criteria, labs will need to report it to the FDA. And you have 30 calendar days to make that report. So it's a fairly tight turnaround. In some cases, event reports need to be submitted within 5 working days. However, I think those scenarios are very unlikely for LDTs. So most likely you're looking at a 30-day window for making a report. So beyond this, laboratories also need to proactively alert FDA if they're making a modification to one of their LDTs due to a defect of some sort. And if a lab ends up removing a test from the market due to a defect, they also need to proactively alert the FDA. And the final component of milestone 1 is documenting and investigating complaints. So if you receive a complaint from a patient or a physician or just some third party, the laboratory will need to document that, investigate it, and some of those could potentially turn into a medical device report as well. Year 2 is registration and listing. So laboratories will need to register as a medical device manufacturer. There is an annual fee for that, around $8,000 per year. The listing requirements are fairly straightforward. It's your test name, company name and address, the owner, and an official correspondent. So that's fairly straightforward. If you have a large test menu, this could still be a significant clerical burden. The piece that I'm more concerned about is labeling requirements. So with an IVD kit, labeling is pretty straightforward. There's a sticker you slap on the side of the box that has a lot of important information. We can't put stickers on LDTs because they're not physical things. And so FDA has helped us out a little bit in understanding what this means for LDTs in the final rule by stating that labeling includes performance information, so your accuracy, precision, et cetera, and then the validation data supporting that performance information. So even if you're not required to submit a given LDT to FDA for authorization or pre-market approval, you may still need to provide FDA with a summary of validation information as part of your labeling. Milestone 3, so year 3, 2027, is quality system. If you're an IVD kit manufacturer, you need to follow a quality system called Good Manufacturing Practices, or GMP. For you regulatory nerds out there like me, this would be ISO 13485. Now, FDA is not saying that laboratories performing LDTs need to be fully GMP compliant. We don't need to be GMP certified, but we do need to comply with certain elements of GMP. And so the first of those is design controls. Again, maybe a little bit of silver lining. These are probably things that your laboratory is already thinking about when you're designing a test, but in our new world, you'll need to document these things formally. So at a high level, design controls are, what do the patients, physicians, and my lab need from this test? So patients may need specific analytes, for example, or a particular reportable range. Physicians may need report comments that help them interpret what the testing means. My laboratory might need a particular throughput or turnaround time. So all those things need to be documented. And then once you complete your validation, you need to ensure that your test still meets all of those design control elements. The next component is purchasing controls. Again, you probably have the start of this at least. So purchasing controls is developing written specifications for all of your critical reagents and critical materials, and then evaluating your suppliers. Can they meet those quality requirements that you need? And then you need to determine how you're going to control those supplies. So for example, do you need to do lot-to-lot comparisons on particular reagents, for example? And then you need to monitor the performance of your vendors over time to make sure that they can continue meeting those specifications. And then finally, CAPA, or corrective action, preventative action, very closely aligned with adverse event reporting. So you need procedures to describe how you are going to determine the corrective action to fix a problem, who is responsible for doing so, and then how you're going to document all of this. So let's take a little break from milestones and talk about records. So FDA does indicate that all laboratories performing LDTs will need to comply with record requirements. And so there is a term here to introduce you to, and that is a device master record. This is really intended to be a one-stop shop for all information related to a test. So this would include your test specifications, accuracy, precision, et cetera, but also specimen type, storage conditions, methodology, et cetera. All of the procedures, so not only how to perform the test, but how to perform maintenance on any instrumentation, any QA or QC activities that you need to do, your validation information, of course, validation data, and then finally, any modifications you make to your test over time need to be included in this device master record. Now, FDA does note that the DMR needs to include this information or refer to the location of. So if you're in a paper-based environment, you don't necessarily have to have everything in the same file cabinet drawer or electronically in the same server location, but you need a cross-reference where everything is located so you can quickly find it. So for example, if an FDA inspector walks through the door and they want to see information about a particular test, you'll need to be able to quickly and efficiently gather all that information. So that's what the DMR is meant to help with. So those are the first 3 years of requirements. And then we move into submissions. Now, one big change from the proposed rule to the final rule is that FDA is incorporating some targeted enforcement discretion. And Dr. Binnicker is going to tell you a bit more about those.
Great. Thanks, Shannon. So yes, there's an important phrase that we want you to have a strong appreciation of after today's presentation. That's enforcement discretion. The important thing to point out is that the FDA is not phasing in enforcement discretion. They are not implementing new tiers of discretion. They are phasing out their general enforcement discretion over lab-developed tests. The FDA has felt that it has the authority to regulate LDTs, but they have applied enforcement discretion not to do that. That is phasing out over the next several years. There will be several categories, though, of tests that will continue, at least currently, to fall under that enforcement discretion. And I want to walk you through those categories. The first category are tests that were previously offered as lab-developed tests before May 6th of 2024. So any test that labs had developed on their own prior to that date will fall under the first category of continued enforcement discretion, with the ability to make very limited modifications to those tests. And I'm sure that we'll talk more about modifications in the question and answer period. The second category is a lab performing lab-developed tests within a healthcare system. So if the testing is only being done on patients that are seen within your healthcare system and there's no outreach program associated with your laboratory, that will continue to fall under the enforcement discretion of the FDA. An important caveat to that is that the testing must address an unmet need. In other words, there are not other available approved diagnostics for that particular condition. If we go to the next slide, we'll see the third category for continued enforcement discretion. And those are the lab-developed tests that have been reviewed and approved by the New York State CLEP. Now, an important point to make with this is that a lab must be New York State permitted currently. So, in other words, a way to get around the FDA submission process will not be to just submit your test to New York State as an alternative. You have to be a New York State permitted laboratory to submit those tests and have them reviewed and approved by New York State. And then the fourth category kind of falls under the other category, which are tests that were developed and implemented pre-1976. The FDA considers these to be traditional bread and butter tests that are not highly sophisticated in terms of their complexity, and also tests that would fall under HLA testing, testing for forensic purposes, as well as testing performed for public health measures. So again, want to focus a little bit more on modifications. So tests that, again, have been implemented prior to that May 6, 2024 deadline, and any modifications made to FDA-approved tests would be grandfathered in. One outlier would be any test that would fall under the PMA category or Class 3 category. So what would modifications that would require a submission to FDA be? The first is if you were making a modification to a test that would change its intended use, that would need to be submitted to the FDA, even if it had been implemented prior to that May 6th cutoff. Also, if you're changing any of the critical reaction components, for example, you're implementing new primer probe sets for a molecular test, that would be considered a major modification that would require FDA submission. If you're including significantly different technology, so if you're moving from one platform looking at targeted fluorescence to a multiplex bead fluorescence, for example, that would be considered a major modification. And then any change that would adversely affect the performance or safety specifications of a test would require submission to the FDA. So just to walk through the categories of continued enforcement discretion, again, if you're offering tests that had been implemented prior to May 6th of 2024, those are considered IVDs previously marketed as lab-developed tests. Those will continue to fall under FDA enforcement discretion. The second category are any tests that are 1976-like, for example, HLA testing, forensic testing, public health testing. Testing that is performed within an integrated lab within a health system, and the testing is, again, only performed for internal patients for unmet needs. So in other words, there's no other available approved diagnostic test for a particular condition would fall under continued enforcement discretion. And then finally, have tests been submitted to New York State and reviewed and approved by New York State, those would also be considered for enforcement discretion. If they don't fall into the categories that are outlined on the left-hand side, those tests would then need to go to the FDA for review. Another point that we've made and just want to emphasize again is related to modifications. So modifications that were made prior to that May 6th deadline, both to LDTs as well as FDA authorized tests, would continue to fall under enforcement discretion unless those modifications change the intended use, alter the operating principle, significantly different in terms of the technology performed, or adversely change the performance or safety of that test. In those situations, those modifications would require FDA submission. So just to kind of bring this all together, we look at the enforcement discretion and quality requirements. And I think Shannon's going to walk us through these, and so I'll pass it back over to Shannon.
Great, thanks, Dr. Binnicker. So there are really two components here. There is the quality compliance piece, which are the first three milestones, and then the submission piece, where the enforcement discretion categories come into play. So these tests are completely exempt. Your 1976-like tests, these are tests that do not use any automation and do not use any software. Screening tests for HLA antibodies, like Dr. Binnicker said, forensic tests, and any testing done by the Department of Defense or the Veterans Affairs Department. One quick note on forensic tests. If you are doing a toxicology test and you're using it for forensics, but also clinically, so drugs of abuse screening, for example, in the ED, that now becomes an LDT that's not completely exempt anymore because it's not just being used forensically. But these tests are completely exempt from any requirements, quality or submission. If you have an IVD previously marketed as an LDT, you'll colloquially hear this referred to as grandfathering, even though it's not technically correct, but it's much easier to say than IVDs previously marketed as LDTs. Or if you have a test, an LDT that is performed by a lab integrated with a healthcare system, addressing an unmet need, those tests need to meet phases 1 and 2, so adverse event reporting, complaint handling, registration and listing, and then those record requirements. And finally, if you have tests that are under the New York State enforcement discretion, or you're making modifications to someone else's FDA authorized kit, you need to meet the first two requirements in addition to the select GMP requirements, and then again, of course, records. So the new regulations are positive in the sense that they do have these targeted enforcement discretion categories, which is helpful. It's better than having to submit everything to the FDA. The downside is it's incredibly complicated. Figuring out on a test-by-test basis, does my test fall into one of these enforcement discretion categories? If it doesn't, if you have tests that do not fall into one of the enforcement discretion categories, as Dr. Vinegar mentioned, you are going to have to submit to the FDA. Now, or your test can't be on the market. That's the other option. You can take your test off the market. So at a super high level, FDA has three primary submission pathways in increasing levels of rigor and required evidence. And they start with a very simple question: is there a predicate test? So predicate test is another test that FDA has already reviewed and authorized and is on the market that is something like our test. So for example, if I have a test to detect cute tree frogs, is there another test that looks similar to that test? That we can make the argument that our test is just as accurate, just as good as this other test that FDA has already looked at. I should note that you can have multiple predicates. So there might be one predicate that is a similar analyte and another predicate that is a similar methodology. And between the two of them, we can make the argument that our test is equivalent to those tests. If you can identify one or more predicates, you can use what's called the 510K pathway. So this is kind of the low to moderate risk pathway that FDA has. In FDA parlance, this would be class 1 or class 2 devices generally. And it has the lowest, comparatively, documentation burden. And we'll go into what that entails here in a minute. If there is no predicate, so your test is brand new, it's unique, there's nothing else on the market like it, then you have the option of the de novo pathway or the pre-market approval pathway. So the PMA pathway is for those high-risk tests or class 3 tests. Very onerous, takes a long time, is very expensive. Now, FDA has announced that they do intend to downregulate most LDTs that they would historically consider to be the highest risk down to a moderate risk level. So we're not going to talk about the PMA pathway anymore today because my hope is very few LDTs will have to use that pathway. So then we have de novo. So de novo means there's no predicate, but the laboratory believes that the test is not high risk because there are mitigating factors, there are controls in place, or other mechanisms such that the lab believes the test is not the highest risk. So for the 510K pathway, here's a brief description of what you need. First, a device description and indications for use. So what is my test? What does it do? Why would a physician order it? A description and comparison of those predicates. So here are the devices that FDA has seen and authorized that are similar to our test, and here's why we think that they're similar. So you're basically building the case to the FDA that our test is as safe as something else that's already on the market. Proposed labeling. So again, this would be where your performance characteristics would come in. You describe the accuracy and precision of your data, of your assay, and then the data to back that up. For a de novo, again, device description, intended use. This is what FDA uses to really assess any medical device that crosses their desks. A discussion on controls. Remember, you need to talk about why you believe your test is not the highest risk. So what are you doing to mitigate that risk? Clinical data, this is a key difference. So clinical validity data, it becomes an important component of this. So not only can my test detect the analyte of interest, does it correlate with the disease of interest? Performance testing would be, again, your validation information. And then the other new piece is the benefit risk discussion. So here are the benefits of ordering the test, and here are the risks of ordering the test. And ideally, your benefits would outweigh the risks. Otherwise, there's a slim chance FDA would actually approve your device. So that is kind of a whirlwind tour of the enforcement discretion categories that you ideally want to be in. And if you are unable to fall into one of those categories, the most likely FDA submission pathways that you'll need to consider for milestone 4 and milestone 5. So with that, we want to turn the conversation to things that your lab should be thinking about today to move into compliance. And so for that, I'm going to turn it back over to Dr. Binnicker.
All right, so again, let's cover some practical considerations. What does all of this mean to you, and what will you need to be thinking about over the coming months and years in preparation? The first thing to point out is that the FDA final ruling, its movement to regulating the world of lab-developed tests is happening. And we put that in somewhat air quotes, probably, because there is litigation. There could be possible congressional action. There may be a change in administration within the government. The final rule, though, is in effect now, so I would recommend against being complacent, thinking this may not happen, so I don't need to take any action. It's best to start the planning process now. I think it's also critical to just come to terms with a level of ambiguity. There are a lot of unknowns. There are a lot of unanswered questions at this point, and the FDA will need to continue to provide updated guidance to help us navigate this new world. But it's critical to make a plan at your site for how you'll plan to respond, but you need to be ready to adjust that plan based on new information that's likely to come to light. So, a few questions that you'll need to ask is, are you going to continue to offer your existing lab-developed tests? If the answer to that is yes, you'll need to be in compliance with milestones 1 and 2 that Shannon reviewed. Are you going to continue to offer or modify FDA-authorized test kits? If the answer to that question is yes, you'll need to be in compliance with milestones 1, 2, and 3. If you qualify for enforcement discretion for new laboratory developed tests, that's obviously a good thing. The final ruling included that continued enforcement discretion. But if you don't, the FDA submission process will be expensive. It will require a lot of time and resources. And you may need to consider alternative options as clinical needs arise. A silver lining is that there's no immediate action required today for submissions. The submission process for FDA for any lab-developed tests that don't fall under that continued targeted enforcement discretion, those aren't required to begin until November of 2027. So we have a bit of a runway. You need to comply with relevant milestones, and you can continue offering the testing until that time point. And after that, you'll need to determine whether you'll need to submit to the FDA, whether you fall under one of the targeted enforcement discretion categories that we reviewed, or the ultimate decision may be that you need to take the test off of the market. We're really emphasizing the importance of seeking assistance and seeking assistance early in the process. The number of people nationwide that have the necessary expertise in this area are limited. And so seek out guidance and consultation from experts now to begin developing your plan. You may need to hire internally if you offer a large menu of laboratory developed tests, or an alternative option would be to identify a consulting firm with specific expertise in regulation of testing and diagnostics to get their advice on which pathway you should pursue. So we want to wrap up. We wanted to leave plenty of time for questions and discussion. We did just also want to emphasize that the regulatory rules and compliance requirements that we've discussed today can vary significantly depending on different circumstances. And we're strongly advising that you consult with qualified legal counsel or regulatory professionals who will be able to examine your specific situation to help guide you on the process of putting together a plan for responding again to this new regulatory pathway. So
And
we'll wrap.
Binnicker, if I could just tag on real quick to one of your last points around consultants. I
Yes.
think one thing to be aware of as well is there are lots of medical device consultants out there, but I think there are probably not a lot that understand LDTs and understand clinical laboratories. So just be very judicious in selecting consultants and make sure they understand that LDTs are different than medical devices, so that you don't end up uh, over complying with things that you don't need to comply with.
Great point. Thanks, Shannon. So we've got quite a few questions in the Q&A box that I want to start to walk through. The first one is, does adverse event reporting apply for all testing or just laboratory developed tests? Shannon?
Yeah, that's a great question. So the shorter answer is kind of both. The long answer is more nuanced. So from the FDA rule perspective, FDA is concerned about your LDTs. So if there is an issue with one of your LDTs, you will need to report that to the FDA. However, even prior to the final rule, there was an expectation, it wasn't a requirement, but an expectation. If you're using some sort of an issue with it, that you as a user would also report to the FDA. And so that continues to be the case. Labs are in a little bit of an odd situation now where we are both the manufacturer of an LDT and a user of an LDT. But as far as what you need to report as the manufacturer, it would just be on your own LDTs.
Great. Thanks, Shannon. This next question is related to the registration fees. So is the registration fee that's required charged per test submission or per CLIA number?
Okay, so that is a really good question, and there's a kind of a couple components to it. So as far as the registration fee goes, that is per manufacturing site. It is a little bit of an open question. This is one of those we need additional guidance things. If FDA will charge that per CLIA, per address, I don't think they'd go so far as, you know, an entire health system scattered across multiple cities being able to register as one medical device manufacturer. So I think it's still a little unclear exactly how they're going to parse that out. If I had to guess, I'd say I think per CLIA is probably the most logical thing to assume. Now, the registration fee doesn't charge per test. However, if you need to submit to FDA, so you have a test that doesn't fall into an enforcement discretion category, and you have to submit a 510K de novo or PMA, there is a submission fee for that. So if you're submitting a 510K, it's $25,000 or so dollars. That's just to get it submitted and have the FDA review it. That is not the money and resources you're putting into it. A de novo is 145,000 or so, and a PMA is 450,000 or so. So again, going the FDA route, particularly a PMA, can get very expensive, very time consuming very quickly.
Yeah, thanks, Shannon. I think the unknowns about the registration fees and whether it's for a particular test or for a CLIA site number. I see another question down below of, for an integrated healthcare system. If the system submits a test, would that then apply for any performing site within that system? Or is it going to require a submission for each site performing the testing? I think we just don't know at this point, and we need more guidance from the FDA around whether it's going to be CLIA site specific or test specific. Shane, anything to add there?
No, I think you're spot on.
Okay. This next question is, does forensic testing include workplace drug testing? My initial thought is it would not. Forensic testing is probably more related to testing that would be performed, for example, in a Bureau of Criminal Apprehension for investigation of crime scenes, but testing related. You heard anything?
No, I agree. Forensic testing really is for law enforcement purposes. So that's what that enforcement discretion category is really related to.
Okay. All right. This next question, how does sensitivity testing come into play on a bug-drug combination that isn't on a package insert but needed clinically as, for example, bacteria develop resistance? So this is within the clinical microbiology world for susceptibility testing. If there's not a specific bacteria with a antibiotic with a known susceptibility profile, but you need to perform that testing, how will that fall under it? My initial thought is that that is a significant enough component that it would require a submission to FDA if you're adding on to a specific claim. So if you're using a commercial system that looks at a panel of drugs against a bacteria and you wanted to add on a new drug, that would be considered a major modification that would require data to be submitted to the FDA. Okay. All right, this next question is for an FDA submission. How would one show clinical data for a toxicology confirmation assay? Many patients will not admit to illicit drug use, and a clinical study giving patients illicit substances seems unethical. Agreed. Any advice or thoughts?
But you'd have lots of volunteers for that, though, if you put a call out and say free cocaine for everybody. Yeah, this can be challenging. And I'll also expand the question a little bit. This is also a challenge for rare disease testing as well. Getting clinical validity information can be tough. Now, you don't have to do a prospective clinical trial for these. You can use things like literature references, database searches, case studies. There are a number of options. So in some cases, it may require some ingenuity to come up with how we would demonstrate clinical validity. But certainly in some situations, it's very challenging.
Agreed. I think we addressed this question, but just want to make sure that we touch on it for the category related to exemptions. If you're in an integrated health system, does that apply to all sites, hospitals within a system, or just to a specific location? Again, I think that that's an unknown at this point. For example, if a health system has 3 lab locations that perform a lab-developed test, do each of those 3 locations have to would each of those 3 locations fall under an enforcement discretion, or would the FDA consider that to be, for example, outreach testing? I don't know the answer to that, and I don't think that there's information that helps us really have a firm answer. But Shannon, any thoughts?
Yeah, I don't know if this is answering that question specifically necessarily, but this is the way I think of it. FDA thinks of every, I'll say location. Again, it's a little unclear if that's going to be address, clear certificate, whatever. But every location is sort of a siloed, discrete entity. So if you have 3 hub hospitals in your health system that are in 3 different cities, FDA would most likely consider them to be 3 separate device manufacturers. And if all 3 of them performing on their internal patients, addressing unmet needs, so they are under enforcement discretion, all 3 of those locations would most likely need to list that test under their specific location. And so again, this gets very complicated and messy when you have large hospital systems with many, many laboratories scattered across a wide variety of locations. There may be some fairly significant duplication of effort in some of this.
Yeah. I think because of the level of ambiguity at this point and unknowns, one strategy would be to come up with a tiered plan. In other words, what's your worst case scenario plan, where FDA is going to consider all 3 sites within a health system to be independent? And how would you respond to that versus best case scenario, they consider all performing sites within a health system to be one? And so just think through those different options or possibilities, and don't just assume that things will turn out the way that you're hoping it will turn out. This next question is, do modifications of FDA cleared tests that occurred before the May 6, 2024 count as existing lab developed tests? Shannon?
Yes. I think it is a little unclear if you make subsequent modifications, though, if they would consider that as modifications to your grandfather test or modifications to someone else's FDA authorized kit. However, the quality requirements are the same in either case. So, yes, it would be under enforcement discretion for the pre 5.6, but just bear in mind that if you make further modifications down the road, you'd need to meet those milestone 3 requirements in addition to 1 and 2.
Yeah, agreed. Right. Excluding prognostic biomarkers, ER/PR, HER, PDL1, if a lab has 150 to 200 immunohistochemical antibodies, is it your professional opinion that all of these would need to be FDA submissions if the primary antibody is an IVD? Great question.
Yeah, immunohistochemical stains are complicated because a lot of them are class 1 low risk devices. There is an FDA exemption for IHC reagents. IHC reagents are labeled a lot of different ways. Some of them are IVD, some are RUO, some are ASR. It's all over the map. This is one of those scenarios where I think we're going to need some guidance from FDA and how exactly they want to handle IHCs because of the variety and variability in those stains.
Good. Thanks, Shannon. Do you have some examples of unmet need? So we go back to that enforcement discretion that we discussed of an integrated healthcare system lab can continue to perform testing if it falls under an unmet need. So one example would be a lab is performing sexually transmitted disease testing using an FDA-approved kit, but they have validated or modified the test to be able to look at pediatric samples. Because there's no, to my knowledge, FDA authorized or FDA approved kit out there that is specific for testing pediatric patients for STDs. So that would be an unmet need. You can't go out and purchase another kit that is qualified for that particular clinical need. Or if there is a vaccine preventable disease that you have developed a test to diagnose, such as measles virus. There's no FDA-approved measles kit on the market that you can go out and use, but you've brought that test in for your integrated healthcare system. Shannon, any other examples that you can think of?
So in the final rule, FDA is a little fuzzy on the definition of unmet need. The 2 things they say that do not constitute unmet need are cost. So if your test is cheaper than an FDA authorized version, that's not enough to make it an unmet need, and efficiency. So if there is an FDA authorized kit out there for a particular analyte that takes a month and you've got a test that can do it in 2 days, that's not sufficient for unmet need. This is my personal opinion now, okay? So the disclaimer applies. I think it's going to some extent fall on a laboratory to state their rationale for why they feel they're addressing an unmet need and document that, knowing that FDA could come back, and say, you've registered this test, so we are aware it exists. This other FDA authorized version also exists. Tell us why yours addresses an unmet need. And then you'll have to have a good argument for that.
Agreed. I think we've touched on this next question, but we can just bring it up again. Is a healthcare enterprise or system limited to a specific CLIA number, or can it span several hospitals in a system? And I think, what we've mentioned is that it's a bit of an unknown at this point, exactly how the FDA is going to define a healthcare system.
Yeah, I agree.
Will a New York State Department of Health LDT approved test that was approved this week meet the discretionary enforcement? And I think the answer is yes.
So the important thing to remember is November 2027 is the decision point, right? So by November 2027 for high-risk tests, you either need to fall into enforcement discretion category, be exempt somehow, or make your submission to FDA. So if your test was approved by New York State yesterday, you have made that deadline. If your test gets New York State approved, Well, actually, no, take that back. Yeah. So basically, by that November deadline, that's the decision point. If you don't have New York State approval by November 6th of 2027, then you will need to submit to FDA if that is the one enforcement discretion category that you're eligible for.
Okay. Does this include FDA approved MIC panels, so minimum inhibitory concentration panels that we have verified, or additional organisms breakpoints that are not claimed? So an example would be resistant strains for an organism. So again, I don't think there's a lot of clarity on exactly how this will be interpreted, but my feeling is that if you're offering an approved panel, so we have a panel of drugs on that, and you want to look at an additional antibiotic that may be new to market, that would constitute a major change that would require submission. How the FDA is going to think about breakpoints, I really don't know at this point, and we're going to have to get more clarity on that.
Yeah, I agree. I can't speak to breakpoints, but when I see additional organisms beyond what's in the package insert, that's probably very likely to be a major modification that would need to be submitted to the FDA.
Yeah. Do tests that will continue to qualify for enforcement discretion be subject to fees?
So if you have LDTs, you will need to register and pay the annual registration fee. So that would be the case. If you're not submitting anything to the FDA directly through the 510(k) pathway, for example, there isn't a per test fee. I think that's what the question is.
Good. Newborn screening is a good topic, is part of the public health lab in many states. Do you think it falls under enforcement discretion? I think if you send your newborn screening to your state health lab, I think there's a strong argument that it would fall under enforcement discretion. Some labs, such as ours, do a lot of newborn screening, and that would be considered different. So Shannon, what's your interpretation on that one?
So to my knowledge, there's not a carve out for public health laboratories. So they are still subject to these regulations.
So that's a good point. There's public health testing that falls under the enforcement discretion.
Yes.
Testing performed at a public health laboratory doesn't necessarily mean it's going to fall under enforcement discretion.
Yeah. So the definition of public health surveillance is if I'm aggregating a bunch of data and nothing is going back to an individual patient's medical record. So we did a lot of that obviously during COVID times, for example. That is not subject to these regulations. But if you are doing newborn screening at a public health laboratory and that result will go back to that baby's medical record, it is my understanding that the regulations would apply.
It's a really important point, Shannon. That's why you're the expert. Thank you. We have been asked if the New York State approval transfers to other sites.
Yep.
My thought is no, based on CLIA licenses. And if those sites perform testing on New York State patients, please confirm.
Exactly. So Mayo Clinic has a Rochester campus, an Arizona campus, a Florida campus, right? The Rochester campus is New York State permitted. The Arizona and Florida campuses are not. So this goes back to my comment earlier about FDA is going to look at labs as silos. So in our case, there's going to be a Rochester silo, Arizona silo, and Florida silo. If all three of us are performing the exact same test, and Rochester falls under the New York State enforcement discretion, that has no bearing on Arizona or Florida. So if you have a multi-site health system or laboratories at multiple sites, just because one laboratory falls under enforcement discretion does not automatically mean all other laboratories in your healthcare system performing the same test do. So you need to look at your tests on a test-by-test, site-by-site basis.
What would the FDA submission fee be if you add a new drug to an MIC panel? So yeah, if a lab's going to be making a modification to an FDA test, kind of guidance on what that submission fee might look like, Shannon?
So again, I'll note the disclaimer. So every situation is different. However, most likely that would be a 510(k) submission because the original test kit would be your predicate. And so now you're making a modification to that. So most likely it would be a 510(k) submission. So that is a $25,000 submission fee on top of all the work that you need to do to perform your validation and so forth.
Right. Are H&E stains for routine anatomic pathology using an automated stainer and LDT? What about a GMS stain? Are they all separate LDTs? I think these
Yes.
might fall under the pre-76 category, but what's your thoughts, Shannon?
The automated stainer throws a kink in things
That throws a
because
kink.
the 1976 like tests explicitly say they cannot use automation and cannot use software. So I don't think they fall under that. So this is very similar to my IHC comment. I think when it comes to pathology related staining, let's call it, we're going to need some help from the FDA to really understand their expectations.
Just to confirm, any LDTs after the May 6, 2024 is required for submission if it's an unmet need. So I think the question is, if you bring up an LDT for an unmet need after the May 6 deadline, does it need to be submitted? I think there's a few different possibilities there.
Yeah. So if you introduce an LDT after May 6th of this year, it would not qualify for that IVDs previously offered as LDTs enforcement discretion. So maybe the question here is, would it qualify then for the integrated healthcare system with a test addressing an unmet need? It could, again, as long as you're only offering it internally, your lab is affiliated with an integrated or is integrated into a healthcare system, and you are addressing an unmet need, i.e. there isn't an FDA authorized test on the market that is available to your patient.
Yeah. So as an example, if my lab wanted to bring on a new LDT this week for an unmet need, and we wanted to offer that both for our Mayo Clinic patients and for patients that we care for through our reference laboratory, if we didn't receive New York State approval, we would need to submit to the FDA for that. Just because it's an unmet need and we would be performing it within our health system, within Mayo Clinic, since we're performing it for outreach as well, that would require a submission. If your testing is only going to be performed within your healthcare system and it's for an unmet need, my understanding is that that would fall under the continued enforcement discretion.
It's one really important point, and Dr. Binnicker said this, but I think it bears repeating. If I have a test that is under this enforcement discretion, meeting and addressing an unmet need, integrated healthcare system, and 3 years from now, an IVD manufacturer gets FDA approval for a test that addresses that need, I now either need to submit my test to the FDA or take my test off the market and most likely use the IVD. So bear that in mind. It isn't a get out of jail free card if you fall under that enforcement discretion. Labs will need to continue to monitor to make sure that there aren't FDA authorized kits that come onto the market that meet the same need. And because I know this will probably be a question, if that means I need to buy a different instrument because the FDA authorized version uses a different instrument, I doubt that would allow you to stay in the unmet need category. FDA, frankly, won't care if you need to buy additional instrumentation. So just keep that in mind. Labs will need to continue to monitor this space.
All right, we've got a few more minutes and a few more questions, so we'll try to make it through these. Would the regulations apply to special stains in histology?
I think we addressed that one.
Yep, I agree. This next one, I'm not sure I'll be able to answer, but I'll try. If you're validating a Benchmark Ultra Plus, would that be considered a minor modification if you're comparing it to the Benchmark Ultra? I think if you're moving to a different iteration of an instrument and the chemistry and the testing is still the same, I'm not sure that would require a submission. Shannon, what do you think?
I would tend to agree. If you're moving up model numbers, and as long as like the sensitivity and specificity are roughly comparable, it most likely would not be considered a major modification. If you're changing technologies or methodologies completely, that that would.
How will leukemia and lymphoma testing by flow cytometry be addressed since there are no fully IVD panels? Will each orientation and characterization panel be considered an LDT, or is the platform, i.e. flow, considered an LDT? I don't think it's platform-based. I think it's test-based.
Yeah, so this is where your intended use becomes very important. If you have a very specific intended use, like my test is for this one very, very specific niche lymphoma case, you're going to have a lot of LDTs that you have to submit to FDA. If you write a little bit more broad of an intended use, you potentially could wrap multiple tests or order codes under the same test from FDA. So this is where that regulatory strategy becomes very important, and reaching out to folks who can help you craft the best path forward for your tests.
If we modify an existing FDA-cleared test to meet an unmet need, performed only in an integrated health system, which discretion does it fall under? Will it need to meet phases 1 through 2, 1 through 3?
I suspect if you're modifying someone else's FDA authorized test, you would fall into that modification enforcement discretion and would need to be compliant with 1 through 3, is my suspicion.
Healthcare systems are in a financial crisis throughout the country. How does the FDA expect these added costs to be paid for? Could this cause harm to patients if they're taken off of the market? I mean, I think this is an important comment and point, and many groups have provided feedback to the FDA, which they factored into the final ruling. And I think all labs around the country are going to do the best they can, given the final regulations. But these are definitely points that are important points that are being made. Any thoughts on whether or not the enforcement of this will come under CAP's umbrella at some point? So could the FDA deem CAP as a regulatory agency? My guess is probably not, but who knows?
Yeah, I agree.
All right, final question. It's a question about the lawsuits. We're not going to comment too much on the lawsuits, other there has been litigation, and it does create some questions about what could happen in the future. One is that the final ruling will continue to go ahead as it has been rolled out. Another possibility is there could be a pause. We don't really know. I think the final comment I would make is just to, again, come up with your tiered strategy. Think about the worst case scenario. What would you plan? How would you plan to respond? If things turn out well for us, or best case scenario, how would your plans change? So begin planning now, involve outside expertise, maybe thinking about bringing in people with expertise, because this is a complicated area with a lot of ambiguity and unanswered questions. And Shannon and I just want to again thank all of you for joining us for today's webinar. Have a great day.
Thank you for participating. Please click the button below to complete the evaluation and obtain credit.